Hey guys, tonight we slip straight into the dark, shadows stretching, walls breathing, and silence that feels just a little too alive. It's the kind of night where every creak sounds like footsteps, and every flicker feels like a signal. You probably won't survive this if your imagination gets the better of you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I want to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the heavy air of the Middle Ages, where marriage isn't always about you, not your feelings, not your dreams, and definitely not your idea of romance. It's about alliances, dowries, fields, and property lines. You marry because your family tells you to, because the land must stay in the right hands, because bloodlines need to tighten like knots in rope. You can't exactly say, nah, I'll just date around for a few years. But here's the thing, behind the formal vows, the stiff banquets, the exchange of rings, people were still people. Desire still hummed underneath the wool tunics, longing still burned behind polite nods, and sometimes love, real, raw, unplanned love, squeezed its way through the cracks. You feel it when a young bride, no older than 16, steals glances at her husband she barely knows, or when an older merchant, married for practical reasons, finds himself laughing too long at a wife's clumsy joke and realizing, oh, affection is there after all. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually cared about romantic love in marriage or whether we're just projecting our modern obsession onto them. Some say no, it was all duty. Others point to letters, to diaries, to courtly love poetry tucked into manuscripts, and whisper, of course they cared. One mainstream fact? By the 12th century, the Catholic Church had taken full control of marriage, declaring it a sacrament, binding not just legally but spiritually. That meant your union was holy, indissoluble, though, honestly, not always happy. And the quirky tidbit? In some regions, couples would actually test compatibility before marriage with a bizarre custom called bundling. Imagine this, you and your potential spouse lying in bed together, but separated by a thick board or wrapped in sewn-up sacks, literally stitched into cloth to prevent anything improper. The idea was to encourage conversation, emotional bonding, while keeping hands where they shouldn't be. Spoiler, hands do not always obey the rules. You can almost hear the muffled giggles in the dark, the nervous brushing of fingers by accident, the pounding heart under linen. Marriage was duty, yes, but desire had its way of sneaking under the door like smoke. And here's where the sarcasm drifts in, you think Tinder is complicated. Try having your entire dating pool chosen by your uncle, negotiated over cattle, while monks remind you that even thinking lustful thoughts could stain your soul. Yep, swipe left on eternal damnation. As you trail deeper into the chambers of these arranged bonds, you notice how couples adapt. Some turn cold, speaking only when necessary. Others find warmth, inventing their own kind of affection, gentle touches while serving bread, shared laughter when the fire sputters, inside jokes no priest could hear. It's those little rebellions, those secret smiles, that make medieval marriages more than contracts. And always, behind closed doors, the question lingers, duty first, or longing first? Which wins when the candlelight flickers low and no one is watching? You step further inside, the doors shut heavy, the hinges groan, and suddenly the air is thicker. Tonight is no ordinary night, it's a wedding night, and the rituals that unfold here would probably make you blink twice, then lean closer just to be sure you really heard that right. The medieval bridal chamber wasn't always private. Sometimes it was practically a stage. Picture this, a bed piled high with straw mattresses, sheets that may or may not have been freshly laundered, good luck, and candles sputtering at the edges of the room. The bride, nervous, stiff-backed, her hair loosened by her attendants. The groom, trying to look composed even though his hands are clammy. And, here's the shocking part, an audience. Yes, in some places, family, neighbors, or even lords and priests might escort the couple to bed, praying over them, blessing them, and sometimes lingering a little too long to make sure the union was properly begun. You shiver at that thought. Romance with spectators is about as cozy as trying to eat spaghetti while the whole village cheers you on. Yet this was normal, because marriage wasn't just about love, it was about proof. Proof of alliance, proof of fertility, proof that the vows sealed in the chapel meant something in flesh and blood. One mainstream fact? In medieval France and England, bedding ceremonies were common. Guests paraded the newlyweds into their chamber, tucked them under covers, and only then finally left them. Sometimes the priest would bless the bed, sprinkling holy water across the sheets, like, "Good luck, you two, don't forget God is watching." And here's a quirky tidbit. In parts of Wales, there was a custom where the bride's stockings were thrown across the chamber. If one landed perfectly on the groom's head, it was considered a sign of fertility and future children. Imagine nervously stripping off socks while half the village bets on your aim. It's like medieval beer pong, but with higher stakes. Of course, historians still argue whether these practices were widespread or more symbolic than literal. Some scholars insist the audience usually stopped at the threshold, giving couples privacy. Others point to accounts that describe actual witnesses to consummation, which makes you wince. Talk about pressure. But once the doors finally shut, once the whispers and laughter faded down the hallway, what happened then? That's when the real mystery begins. For some, the night was tender, two strangers trying to break through shyness, fumbling toward comfort. For others, it was stiff, awkward, even fearful, especially if one or both didn't really understand what marriage demanded. Keep in mind, medieval sex education came from sermons that mostly said, "Don't." Not the most practical guidance. And yet, you can almost feel the nervous sweetness in those moments. A young groom, whispering clumsy jokes to calm his bride. A bride, surprising herself with laughter at how heavy his ceremonial tunic is as he fumbles out of it. A pause, a sigh, then the world shrinks to just them, no dowries, no contracts, no cattle. Just two humans behind heavy curtains, hearts pounding louder than the bells that rang that morning. Here's where the joke sneaks in. You complain about hotel staff barging in? Try your mother-in-law waiting outside the door for confirmation. Medieval honeymoons didn't come with complimentary champagne, just communal expectations. And still, in that flickering candlelight, something human and private survives. Couples created rituals of their own, holding hands under the sheets, whispering prayers together, exchanging promises that no priest had written for them. Some even placed tokens, rings, charms, herbs, under the bed for luck, blending faith with folk magic. Because in the end, behind all the ceremonial noise, the bridal chamber was the first real chance for a couple to find out who they might become together. Would they learn tenderness? Would they settle into silence? Or would love, the kind poets called courtly but peasants felt too, begin to grow like a flame in the dark? You linger there, in the hush that follows the bridal chamber, and you realize something strange. Outside, in the streets and halls, people are singing of courtly love, that glittering idea of knights sighing for ladies, of poems slipped under doors, of devotion so pure it could almost levitate off the page. But inside, under wool blankets and drafty rafters, you feel the gap between that fantasy and the day-to-day rhythm of marriage. Courtly love was the Instagram filter of the medieval world, perfect, polished, and often not remotely real. The troubadours of southern France sang of unattainable ladies, usually married to someone else, while knights swore they'd pine to death if denied a smile. You imagine a noblewoman reading one of those verses aloud while her husband mutters in the corner, "You know he's just flattering you for patronage, right?" And yet, the poems mattered. They shaped how people thought about desire, more secretive, more spiritual, sometimes almost worshipful. Historians still argue whether the ideals of courtly love ever trickled down into actual marriages or whether they were just a poetic game, a way to pass the time while sheep grazed and crusades dragged on. Here's the mainstream fact: by the 12th century, courts across Europe, especially Eleanor of Aquitaine's circle, encouraged troubadours and poets who defined this style of longing. Love became a cultural performance, written in rhyme and sung at feasts. And here's the quirky tidbit: some medieval love manuals offered literal instructions on how to flirt. Andreas Capellanus, in The Art of Courtly Love, actually listed rules like, "Marriage is no excuse for not loving," and, "When made public, love rarely endures." Imagine your modern dating app with rules written by a monk moonlighting as Cupid. But step back to the common room of an ordinary peasant house. Here the reality is different. A wife kneads dough before sunrise, a husband returns muddy from the fields. Their words aren't verses about eternal longing, they're jokes about who forgot to feed the pig, or sighs about aching backs. And yet, affection still grows. A stolen smile while sharing a bowl of pottage, a hand brushing against another as they spread hay, a quiet laugh at night when children are finally asleep. It's love, but practical. Less about swooning in gardens, more about holding each other through a harsh winter. And here's your first joke in the glow of this section. Imagine trying to write a courtly poem to your spouse while she interrupts with, "Did you fix the leak in the roof yet?" Talk about ruining the mood. Still, don't underestimate these everyday moments. Couples found ways to weave intimacy through ordinary chores, and sometimes those gestures lasted longer than any troubadour's rhyme. Maybe a farmer hummed the refrain of a ballad while watching his wife thresh grain, or a merchant tucked a flower into his wife's apron before heading out to trade. Small things, but they carried warmth. The contrast is sharp. You have castles filled with songs about burning desire that must never be fulfilled, and cottages where desire and fulfillment are part of survival. Both matter. Both reveal how human hearts resist being reduced to contracts. Historians still debate whether the high ideals of courtly love ever softened arranged marriages, nudging people toward real affection, or whether the whole movement was just a game for nobles with too much time on their hands. What's certain is that behind closed doors, the poetry faded into whispers, touches, and laughter that left no manuscript behind, only echoes. And here's the second little joke for you: courtly love demanded lovers suffer nobly in silence. Meanwhile, your average peasant husband probably suffered nobly because he stepped barefoot on a chicken. Very different schools of philosophy. You can almost hear it now, the hum of lutes in the great hall, swelling with longing verses, while a peasant child giggles at her parents' inside joke by the fire. Both stories of love, both true in their own ways. Because whether in rhyme or in routine, couples still reached for each other, and that reaching, awkward or poetic, is where intimacy really lived. You slide past the verses and laughter, deeper into the place where all masks fall away, the bedroom. But don't expect plush privacy with scented sheets. A medieval bedroom wasn't always a room at all. Sometimes it was just a wooden frame in the corner of a one-room cottage, where children, grandparents, and maybe even a goat were within arm's reach. Intimacy had to be carved out of noise and chaos, like whispering in a crowded subway car, only with hay rustling under your back. In richer homes, the bed was a status symbol. Nobles and wealthy merchants displayed carved oak frames, canopies with heavy curtains, feather mattresses that weighed more than some peasants. A bed was so valuable it might be included in a will, passed down like treasure. Picture this: your great-uncle dies, and instead of leaving you money, he leaves you a creaky bed with suspicious stains. Congratulations. One mainstream fact: in medieval England, bed sharing wasn't limited to couples. Travelers, servants, even strangers might share a bed simply because space and warmth were scarce. Think of it as Airbnb, without the app, and with way more lice. And here's the quirky tidbit: some noble beds had locks. Yes, actual locks on the bed frame, so no one could sneak in or out unnoticed. Was it for theft, or for guarding secrets? Historians still argue whether those locks were more symbolic, "Look, our union is secure," or practical, meant to stop a sneaky lover or servant from slipping in. Behind those curtains, couples finally gained a little privacy. Heavy cloth muffled sound and shadowed movement. Imagine tugging those curtains closed, the flickering light of a rush candle softening to gold, the air suddenly quieter. You breathe easier, it's just the two of you now. But here's the first joke of the night: you know how annoying it is when your phone alarm goes off at the wrong moment. In the medieval bedchamber, the equivalent interruption was the family rooster, who apparently had no respect for mood lighting. Still, those curtains meant freedom. Couples could talk, tease, even quarrel without the whole household watching. They whispered in dialects no scribe would ever bother recording, they laughed at small accidents, like spilling wine over the sheets, and sometimes they sat in silence, just listening to the wind battering shutters. But the medieval bed was also symbolic. Consummation made a marriage real, which meant the bed was both furniture and courtroom. Families might check the sheets for blood in the morning, proof of virginity and union. Creepy, yes, but this ritual mattered for inheritance, legitimacy, and alliances. And here's the second joke: imagine being judged by your laundry. One bad wash and suddenly your marriage contract looks suspicious. Talk about pressure to buy better detergent. But despite those heavy expectations, real intimacy grew in these spaces. Maybe a couple prayed together before sleep, whispering the Lord's Prayer in sync. Maybe they swapped gossip, joked about neighbors, or dreamed aloud about future children. These weren't poems or chronicles, just shared breaths in the dark. Historians still debate how much privacy couples truly had. Some argue the crowded nature of medieval households made intimacy almost impossible without others knowing. Others believe those thick curtains, hushed voices, and midnight hours created a cocoon of secrecy. And here's the third joke: soft and sleepy. You know how modern couples argue over thermostat settings. In the Middle Ages, the fight was over who got more of the wool blanket. Different century, same drama. You step back and see it clearly now: the bed wasn't just a place for rest. It was a stage, a fortress, a secret diary with no pages. Behind the curtains, couples found a pocket of space where duty could soften, where desire could breathe, and where, just maybe, love could grow in the flicker of candlelight. You linger in that shadowy bedchamber, but your gaze drifts toward something even subtler than heavy curtains: the language of longing. Because not every couple could pour desire into words face to face. Instead, they slipped it into tokens, letters, and gestures so small you might miss them, until you start noticing the patterns. Think of it: a nobleman at war, quill scratching across parchment, sending his wife a letter with phrases wrapped in biblical metaphors: my rib, my heart, my solace. A peasant husband, who cannot write, leaving instead a carved wooden spoon as a wedding gift, etched with little hearts and vines. Both are saying the same thing: I choose you, I remember you, I want you to feel me even when I'm gone. Mainstream fact? By the later Middle Ages, literacy was spreading, not just among clerics, but merchants and noblewomen too. Surviving collections of letters show real tenderness. Husbands wrote of missing their wives, wives wrote back about longing for their husband's safe return. These weren't lofty troubadour verses, they were blunt, sweet, sometimes almost desperate. And the quirky tidbit? Lovers sometimes sent locks of hair as keepsakes. But one preserved love token is weirder. A folded note from the 15th century contained a nail clipping. Imagine your partner mailing you that and saying, "Keep it close to your heart." Romantic? Disturbing? Historians still argue whether such odd tokens carried magical significance or were just, "Hey, this is literally part of me." You imagine it now, someone reaching under their mattress to retrieve a ribbon scented with rosemary, their spouse's gift, lifting it to their nose before sleep. Or slipping a coin engraved with initials into their boot for luck before heading to market. No flashy jewelry ads needed, these tokens worked because they whispered instead of shouted. Here's the first joke: imagine sending your crush a Snapchat streak, except it takes 3 months to arrive by horse, and by the time they reply, you've already married someone else. Medieval long-distance relationships were brutal. But couples didn't always need parchment or trinkets. Sometimes, flirtation lived in gestures. A man brushing flour off his wife's cheek, lingering a little too long. A wife setting aside the biggest chunk of bread for her husband at supper. Even glances carried coded meanings. Picture a feast, across a crowded table, eyes lock for one heartbeat too long, and suddenly both know something is brewing. Historians still argue how widespread romantic agency was. Did ordinary couples actually flirt, court, and build affection, or did most just accept duty? Letters suggest both. Some couples clearly adored each other, others tolerated, endured, or quietly drifted apart. And here's the second joke, soft like a wink. Medieval poetry often praised a lady's forehead. Not her eyes, not her smile, her forehead. You try sliding that into modern dating, girl, your forehead got me weak. Somehow, it doesn't land the same way. Still, these old gestures carried real weight. A ribbon knotted twice might mean, "I miss you." A pressed flower tucked into a psalter might whisper, "Remember me." And the absence of a token could wound more deeply than a harsh word. And here's the third joke: medieval gifts sometimes included live animals. Imagine getting a goose as a love token and thinking, "Wow, thanks, babe. Just what I wanted, another mouth to feed." Yet behind every token, every note, every sideways glance, you sense the same heartbeat, people reaching out, trying to bridge distance, trying to remind each other they were more than contracts and alliances. They wanted affection. They wanted connection. And they found 100 secret ways to slip it past the watchful eyes of priests, parents, and neighbors. So when you imagine that dark room now, don't just see curtains and beds. See the ribbon tucked under the pillow, the folded parchment on the shelf, the pressed flower falling silently from a book when a candle's flame makes the night feel too long. Those were the love letters of the Middle Ages, silent, fragile, but deeply alive. You hold that pressed flower in your hand, and suddenly the air shifts, warmer, stranger. Because medieval couples didn't just flirt with words or tokens, they believed touch itself could heal, curse, or bind. The body wasn't just skin and bone, it was a battlefield of magic, faith, and superstition. You picture it, a wife brushing her husband's hair after a long day. To us, that's simple tenderness. But to her, it might also be protection, because hair carried power. Some believed if a stranger got hold of your hair or nails, they could cast spells to stir desire or destroy fidelity. Touch, then, wasn't innocent, it was charged. Mainstream fact? The church laid down rules about touch. Manuals for confessors warned against improper caresses, even between spouses, because marital intimacy was supposed to aim at children, not pleasure. That meant holding hands under the blanket could be scrutinized almost as heavily as anything more. And the quirky tidbit. In some villages, people swore that kissing the inside of someone's elbow, or, in a few accounts, the back of their knee, could trigger unshakable passion. Imagine couples giggling in the dark, bending elbows with the seriousness of a sacred ritual. Historians still argue whether these customs were common practice or just folkloric oddities, but the fact that anyone wrote them down suggests someone believed. Touch carried risk, yes, but also immense comfort. Imagine lying in a cold stone house in winter. No central heating, no insulation. Just your spouse's body beside you, a wall of warmth. Fingers interlacing under coarse wool felt like fire. A hand at the small of your back meant safety when storms rattled the shutters. Here's your first joke. You think holding hands in public today is rebellious in some cultures. In medieval sermons, priests warned that even lingering touches could open the gate to sin. Which basically means medieval teenagers invented side hugs centuries before youth groups. But the fear of touch wasn't always about sin. Some people genuinely thought certain touches could transfer illness or curses. A husband might hesitate before touching his wife during her monthly cycle, fearing contamination, while she, on the other hand, might have believed her touch in that state could ward off evil spirits. Contradictory? Absolutely. But welcome to medieval medicine, where everything was up for debate. Historians still argue whether medieval couples leaned more toward caution or indulgence. Did they really abstain whenever priests demanded? Or did they quietly ignore the rules behind closed doors, trusting the privacy of curtains and nightfall? Letters, jokes, and marginal doodles suggest that yes, rules were often bent, if not outright ignored. And here's the second joke. Imagine confessing every forbidden touch to your priest. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I brushed my wife's hair too fondly. Even the priest probably rolled his eyes at some point. Yet despite all the fear, you can almost feel the tenderness in these gestures. A thumb brushing across a palm during prayer. A kiss at the temple when no one was looking. A wife massaging her husband's sore shoulders after he hauled stones all day. These weren't just caresses, they were acts of survival, grounding each other in a world that was often cold, dangerous, and uncertain. And here's your third joke, gentle this time. Medieval guides actually listed which days of the week were safe for marital intimacy. Imagine scheduling affection like a dentist appointment. Sorry, love, it's Wednesday. The stars forbid it. Still, the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. Medieval touch lived on two levels. On the surface, sermons, rules, fears. But beneath that, couples reaching for each other anyway, choosing warmth, choosing comfort, choosing small rebellions of intimacy. And in those rebellions, real love slipped through like candlelight under a door. The candle flickers low, and suddenly you hear another sound, not laughter this time, but whispers that feel heavier. Because touch, tokens, and quiet rebellion all lived under the looming shadow of priests and prohibitions. The church wasn't just outside your door, it crept into your bedroom, dictating what was allowed and what would earn you a fast-track ticket to confession. Marriage was holy, yes, but the church insisted that even within it, desire had rules. Too much pleasure? Dangerous. The wrong time of year? Forbidden. The wrong posture? Sinful. You feel the weight of those restrictions pressing down, as though every tender moment had an audience, not your neighbors now, but saints and angels peeking from rafters. Mainstream fact? Medieval penitential manuals spelled out shocking details. Some declared that intimacy was banned on Sundays, feast days, Lent, Advent, the 3 days before receiving communion, and on the eve of major holy festivals. In some calendars, that left fewer permitted nights than forbidden ones. Imagine pulling out a chart just to see if tonight's safe. And the quirky tidbit. Some confessors genuinely believed couples should avoid intimacy if it thundered outside, because thunder was a sign of divine displeasure. Historians still argue whether anyone followed such rules strictly, or if most just nodded to the priest and carried on as usual once the candles were out. You can almost picture it now, a weary couple, lying side by side, whispering, "Is it a feast day? Did Father Thomas say Friday counts? Wait, did we hear thunder?" Talk about mood killers. Here's your first joke: forget birth control apps. Medieval couples had priest control apps, only the notifications came as angry sermons. Warning, Tuesday is off limits. Please abstain to avoid eternal fire. But restrictions weren't just about timing. The church taught that intimacy was for procreation, not pleasure. Anything else, lustful thoughts, playful experiments, was sinful. Some guides even advised couples to remain as still and unemotional as possible. Which, frankly, makes you imagine the least romantic honeymoon ever. Darling, please, no smiling, it's against regulations. Yet, human nature doesn't bend so easily. Behind closed doors, couples found ways to laugh, to play, to bend the rules. A wink, a whisper, a teasing remark that turned duty into something warmer. And maybe afterward, a sheepish trip to confession, where priests had heard it all before. Historians still argue whether these prohibitions actually shaped behavior or if people mostly ignored them. The surviving jokes in manuscripts, the playful drawings in margins, the candid letters suggest many couples carried on with very human affection, even while nodding to church rules. Here's your second joke. One medieval text warned men not to get too enthusiastic, lest they weaken their eyesight. Which means somewhere in 13th century Europe, a guy squinted at a blurry candle and thought, so it's true. But behind the humor lies tension. Couples wanted warmth, but they lived with guilt. A wife might confess in tears, believing her longing was sinful. A husband might fast for days to atone for passion he couldn't suppress. Some even believed the devil lurked near beds, waiting to claim souls who indulged too freely. And yet, despite the warnings, you sense resilience. Couples prayed together after, blending sin and sanctity. They whispered apologies to saints, then whispered sweeter things to each other, balancing faith with human need. Here's the third joke, sleepy but sharp. Modern couples argue about Netflix choices. Medieval couples? They argued whether St. Augustine would be disappointed in them. Same energy, different stakes. So you see it now, love lived under watchful eyes, but even rules as thick as cathedral walls couldn't smother it. Couples carved out tenderness in the cracks, proving that no matter how many prohibitions the church wrote down, affection found a way, soft, defiant, and deeply human. The rules echo still, heavy as bells, but tonight you notice something more secretive: jars tucked behind cupboards, whispers traded at markets, old women muttering recipes by firelight. Because when couples wanted children, or didn't, they turned to strange concoctions, charms, and folklore tricks. Imagine a peasant wife, worried about too many mouths to feed, slipping into the woods to gather herbs by moonlight. Or a noblewoman, desperate for an heir, summoning a midwife who knew both medicine and magic. You realize quickly, in the Middle Ages, fertility was half science, half sorcery, and entirely nerve-wracking. Mainstream fact? The church forbade contraception, teaching that every union must remain open to life. Yet archaeological finds and medical texts reveal that couples used methods anyway: herbal pessaries made from rue or pennyroyal, potions of wild carrot seeds, or even animal intestines fashioned into early barriers. Not glamorous, but inventive. And the quirky tidbit? In one bizarre recipe, crocodile dung was suggested as a contraceptive paste. That's right, someone, somewhere, thought smearing exotic animal poop would stop pregnancy. Historians still argue whether this was ever actually practiced in Europe, or just one of those ideas copied endlessly from ancient texts, like medieval life hacks nobody tested. But not all remedies were about prevention. some were about increasing passion. Recipes called for wine mixed with ground sparrow brains, or charms sewn into little bags and tied around the waist. You imagine couples raising eyebrows at the taste. Darling, this love potion tastes suspiciously like pigeon. Here's your first joke. Modern couples argue about kale smoothies. Medieval couples, they argued whether boiled goat's milk with nutmeg would ignite the blood. Not exactly a Starbucks order. And then there were the rituals. Some women wore amulets with carved runes, others tied red ribbons around their thighs. Men might whisper charms before entering the bed, calling on saints for fertility or on pagan echoes for virility. The line between prayer and spell was blurry, sometimes indistinguishable. Historians still argue whether these folk practices worked as psychological comfort or whether some had real contraceptive properties. For instance, wild carrot seed has been shown in modern studies to have mild anti-fertility effects. Was it accidental science, or ancient wisdom dressed as magic? But beyond recipes and charms, you sense the human urgency. A woman who already had 6 children might have prayed desperately for one night of freedom from pregnancy. A couple without any children might have endured whispers, suspicion, and pressure, turning every ritual into a desperate plea. Here's the second joke. Soft in the flickering dark, some medieval guides warned against eating too many onions, claiming they overheated the blood and caused lust. Imagine blaming your flirtation not on chemistry, but on the salad. Sorry, darling, it was the onions talking. And in the marketplace, rumors flew. One neighbor swore a tea of sage would close the womb. Another whispered that placing a knife under the bed would guarantee conception. Couples tested, doubted, tried again. Behind every superstition was the same truth: they wanted a say in their own lives, even when priests thundered otherwise. Here's the third joke. You think modern birth control ads are awkward? Imagine your village elder pitching a recipe of dried beaver testicles ground into powder. Trust me, it works. That's one commercial break nobody asked for. Still, these potions and tricks tell you something tender. They show couples were in this together, experimenting, laughing at failures, clutching hope when success finally came. They remind you that behind the weirdness, the dung, the charms, the questionable stews, was a very human longing to shape love and family on their own terms. So as you close the cupboard door on those jars, you feel it. Intimacy wasn't just whispered in bed. It was brewed in kitchens, sewn into charms, hidden in herb gardens where hope and fear grew side by side. You leave the cupboards of herbs behind and step closer to where the laughter is, the kind muffled by blankets, sparked by winks and playful nudges. Because intimacy wasn't always solemn or rule-bound. Sometimes, behind closed doors, couples teased, joked, and played with each other in ways that feel surprisingly familiar. Think of a husband sneaking up behind his wife as she kneads bread, flour smudging her cheek, and poking her ribs until she squeals. Or a wife hiding her husband's boots so he has to stumble around the cottage barefoot, both of them laughing while the children roll their eyes. It's easy to forget that medieval marriages, though bound by duty, were also human partnerships, full of humor. Mainstream fact? Medieval literature actually preserved jokes about marital life. Fabliaux, short, often bawdy French tales, mocked husbands, wives, and priests alike. They show that humor was part of how people processed the awkwardness of desire and domestic life. And the quirky tidbit? Archaeologists uncovered medieval dice and board games that couples may have played in the evenings. Some versions even had forfeit rules, lose the round, and you might owe your partner a kiss or a playful chore. Historians still argue whether these games were mostly innocent fun or whether they doubled as subtle courtship rituals for both married and unmarried folk. Here's the first joke for you. Think couples board games are intense today? Imagine Monopoly, but instead of buying property, you're gambling over who gets the last hunk of cheese. Now that's high stakes. Even in noble households, laughter seeped into the chambers. Chronicles mention kings and queens teasing each other in public, like Edward II being mocked by Queen Isabella for his clumsy dancing. If that's what they allowed outsiders to see, imagine the gentle banter when doors finally closed. And yet, humor was more than entertainment, it was survival. Winters were brutal, food was scarce, disease lingered. To laugh in bed, to tickle each other in the straw, to invent silly names in private, that was defiance against hardship. Historians still argue how much levity existed in everyday married life. Some paint the Middle Ages as grim, humorless, locked down by religion. Others point to the endless jokes in manuscripts, the caricatures scribbled by monks in margins, the carnival traditions that turned the world upside down for a day. Surely, that spirit found its way into homes and marriages. Here's the second joke. Sermons sometimes warned against laughter in bed, saying it distracted from the solemn duty of marriage. Which basically meant, no pillow talk, no giggles, no jokes. Imagine a priest wagging his finger, "Stop laughing, you're sinning." And the couple nodding politely, then cracking up as soon as the door closed. And beyond laughter, there were games of touch. Tickling, mock wrestling, chasing each other around beds or barns. Play was physical and silly, but it built bonds. Imagine two peasants rolling in hay, wheezing with laughter, hay stuck in their hair, and in that ridiculous moment, feeling more connected than in 1,000 prayers. Sometimes couples even invented little code phrases or nicknames. A wife might call her husband, "my ox," half joking, half praising his strength. A husband might tease his wife as, "my sparrow," laughing at her quick temper. These small, private jokes stitched intimacy like thread through cloth. Here's the third joke, light as a wink. Medieval medical texts warned men not to laugh too much in bed because it weakened the seed. Which is basically the worst party pooper line ever written in Latin. But you know better now. Laughter in medieval marriages wasn't weakness, it was glue. It softened the weight of duty, it carved joy out of cold stone nights, and it turned arranged alliances into partnerships that sometimes, quietly, secretly, blossomed into love. So when you lean closer to that bedchamber tonight, don't just hear whispers of prayers or sighs of duty. Hear the muffled giggles, the silly arguments over blankets, the warmth of two people finding joy where no one else was watching. The laughter fades now, but in its place comes something sharper, suspicion. Because where there is intimacy, there is also the shadow of infidelity, jealousy, and watchful eyes. Behind closed doors, couples might share tenderness, but outside those doors, gossip traveled faster than arrows. Marriage was duty, yes, but temptation wandered the streets. A traveling merchant flashing smiles at innkeepers. A lady of the court blushing at her husband's squire. Even peasants had to navigate the danger. Too much laughter with the neighbor at the well could spark rumors. And in a world where reputation was survival, whispers could wound more than swords. Mainstream fact? Medieval law codes often punished adultery harshly, especially for women. In parts of France, a wife caught with another man could face mutilation or even death, while her husband might be treated more leniently for the same crime. The double standard was as medieval as the stone walls themselves. And the quirky tidbit. In some regions, if a couple was accused of infidelity, they were subjected to bizarre trial by ordeal. One story tells of a woman forced to walk over hot plowshares to prove her innocence. If she didn't burn, she was pure. Spoiler, feet burn. Always. Historians still argue whether these trials were truly practiced widely or were more symbolic, meant to frighten people into behaving. But it wasn't just law, it was surveillance. Neighbors, servants, even relatives acted as watchmen. Curtains gave privacy, yes, but walls were thin, and gossip thicker. Imagine the paranoia, a husband coming home late, wife narrowing her eyes. Or a wife laughing too freely at a feast, husband grinding his teeth. Jealousy brewed quickly in households already tense with duty. Here's your first joke: you think your phone's "Find My Friends" is invasive? Try living in a village of 60 people where everyone knows if you took an extra long walk by the river. That's medieval GPS. Even in noble courts, affairs bloomed. Troubadour songs weren't just fantasies, they sometimes mirrored real liaisons between knights and ladies. Chronicles spill hints of queens accused of straying, kings keeping mistresses, nobles sneaking letters. Yet behind the scandal was risk. A discovered affair could end in banishment, annulment, or worse. Still, historians argue whether actual adultery was as rampant as literature suggests, or whether the exaggeration came from moralists who loved scandal. Did people cheat more, or did people just talk about it more? Hard to say, but gossip itself could destroy a marriage even without proof. Here's the second joke: medieval husbands often swore their jealous rages were justified because of dreams they'd had. Imagine that, grounding a whole marital argument on a dream. "Darling, I saw you with Jeffrey in my sleep, therefore it's true." That's not evidence, that's insomnia. Yet some couples turn jealousy into comedy. There are surviving fabliaux about husbands locking their wives in towers to keep them faithful, only for wives to outsmart them. These tales mocked the absurdity of control, hinting that even in the Middle Ages, people knew jealousy could become ridiculous. But you can feel the tension even in humor. Couples navigated trust carefully. A wife might leave her husband a token to reassure him. A husband might insist on prayers together to ward off temptation. Some used charms, believing a knot tied in a garment could bind a partner's fidelity. Here's the third joke, whispered like a smirk. One charm suggested putting powdered pig's teeth in your partner's drink to keep them faithful. Nothing says romance like surprise pork dust in your wine. Still, beneath all the jealousy and suspicion, there was something deeper: fear of abandonment. A wife without her husband's protection could lose land, children, livelihood. A husband betrayed could lose honor, face ridicule, and doubt his bloodline. Infidelity wasn't just emotional, it was survival. So you feel it now, the heavy curtain isn't just hiding warmth, but also secrecy. Lovers walking a razor's edge, spouses glancing nervously at neighbors, couples praying their trust holds strong against whispers. Behind closed doors, desire and doubt wrestle together, sometimes tender, sometimes cruel, but always human. The whisper of suspicion lingers in the hallways, but when you step deeper, you hear something more steady: the rhythmic hum of prayer, the low chanting of psalms, the muttered Latin syllables before candles flicker out. Because in medieval bedrooms, religion and intimacy were never far apart. Imagine it: before slipping under blankets, a couple kneels at the bedside, crossing themselves, whispering Pater Noster. Then, climbing into bed, they glance at the crucifix hanging above them, watching. The idea was clear: God was in the room too, even in the most private of moments. Mainstream fact? The Church taught that marital intimacy was a sacred duty, primarily for procreation. Texts like those of Thomas Aquinas emphasized that while sex inside marriage was not sinful, it should never become lustful indulgence. Moderation, restraint, and prayer were the guiding rules. And the quirky tidbit? Some medieval penitentials, a kind of priest's handbook for confession, listed oddly specific sins. One even warned against intimacy on certain holy days, which, when added up, could restrict couples to only a few dozen nights per year. Historians still argue whether ordinary people actually obeyed such strict calendars, or whether most winked and carried on anyway. You chuckle softly at the first joke. Imagine having to check a church-approved intimacy calendar before kissing your spouse. Sorry, love, it's St. Barnabas Day again. That's medieval romance red tape. But it wasn't only restriction, religion also shaped affection. Couples prayed for fertility, for harmony, for protection from temptation. Many even believed saying a psalm together after marital union could sanctify the act, cleansing it of excess desire. Tender, in its own restrained way. In noble houses, priests sometimes blessed the marital bed itself, sprinkling holy water on sheets before the first night. Picture it, candles glowing, guests gathered outside to witness the blessing, as if the couple's intimacy were part performance, part sacrament. A strange blend of public and private. Historians still argue whether couples internalized this piety deeply, or whether most smiled politely in church but lived more freely at home. Some letters between spouses suggest genuine guilt when they failed church expectations. Others show playful disregard. Perhaps it depended on personality, then as now. Here's your second joke. Some priests warned that angels turned their faces away during intimacy. Which means somewhere, a medieval couple probably whispered, quickly, don't look up. Imagine feeling embarrassed not by neighbors, but by invisible celestial witnesses. Yet religion also offered comfort. If a wife died in childbirth, prayers framed her suffering as holy. If a husband traveled for months, prayers bound the couple together across distance. Religious rituals gave language to longing, to grief, to hope. Couples also shared pilgrimages. A husband and wife might walk together to a shrine, leaving tokens, asking saints for children, or for fewer of them. The act itself was bonding, trudging side by side, sleeping on straw in inns, whispering prayers at relics. Behind the solemnity, maybe laughter too, two travelers grumbling about sore feet, yet sharing a rare escape from the daily grind. And sometimes, devotion spilled into the playful. Love poems from the period borrowed religious language, comparing a lover's beauty to visions of saints. Affection dressed in holy words. Sacred and sensual tangled like ivy on stone. Here's the third joke, warm and dry. One medieval monk wrote that couples should pray before and after union to remain pure. Which, if followed literally, turned every kiss into a liturgical service. Let us begin with the opening hymn, not exactly mood music. So you see it now, faith pressed against the walls of every bedchamber. For some, it was comfort, for others, a cage. But always, it was there, candles flickering beside crucifixes, prayers whispered between sighs, devotion stitched into desire. The door closes softly again. Behind it, two people lie side by side, between straw and sheet, between laughter and faith, believing, doubting, or simply hoping their love somehow counts as holy. The candles flicker low now, but instead of prayers, you hear another kind of whisper, a longing for something farther away. Because in the Middle Ages, love and desire weren't always contained neatly inside marriage. Sometimes, the heart leaned outward, drawn by romance, fantasy, and forbidden daydreams. You picture a knight returning from the tourney, helmet under his arm, sweat still glistening on his brow. His wife greets him dutifully, but across the hall, her eyes catch the gaze of another, perhaps his squire, or perhaps a visiting minstrel. That glance alone was dangerous, thrilling, forbidden. And in a society where duty pressed heavily, those small rebellions of the heart carried enormous weight. Mainstream fact? Courtly love literature, those poems and romances sung by troubadours, was rarely about husbands and wives. It often celebrated longing for someone else's spouse, elevating unconsummated desire into a spiritual ideal. Love was meant to be noble, aching, unattainable. And the quirky tidbit? Some noble courts, especially in southern France, staged love courts, where ladies and knights debated questions of passion, Was it nobler to love without touch, or to risk scandal for a kiss? Historians still argue whether these courts were real practices or just literary inventions, but the fact that they were written about shows how powerful the idea of forbidden love was. First joke, Featherlight. Imagine a court of love today, sitting in front of judges who ask whether your crush on your coworker is morally superior to your crush on your neighbor. That's medieval daytime TV. But the yearning wasn't only noble. Peasants had their own small rebellions. A woman forced into marriage with a man twice her age might secretly pine for the boy she'd grown up alongside. A man tethered to his wife's dowry might fantasize about the innkeeper's daughter who smiled when she handed him ale. Forbidden love seeped into taverns and fields just as much as castles. The risk, though, was sharp. To act on those desires meant not only sin, but ruin. Families could be disgraced, alliances broken. And yet, people still wrote letters, carved hearts into wood, exchanged tokens under cloaks. Even the sternest sermons couldn't snuff out that spark. Historians still argue whether these passions were widespread realities or mostly confined to poetry. Did knights truly pledge themselves to unattainable ladies? Or was it more performance, a cultural game of words, not deeds? The truth, as always, probably sits between parchment and pulse. Here's your second joke. Troubadours sang about dying of love if their lady didn't smile. Which is dramatic enough, but imagine explaining that in the village tavern. Sorry, can't help with hay tomorrow, I'm too busy dying from unrequited love. But behind the satire was truth, longing itself could feel alive. For people whose daily lives were bound by work and ritual, the fantasy of a secret love was oxygen. To write a poem, to slip a glance, to dream of what could never be, those moments gave the heart a freedom it rarely tasted. And sometimes, forbidden love became rebellion. Chronicles whisper of abbots' daughters running away with wandering musicians, of wives disappearing with knights, of clerics breaking their vows for stolen kisses. Each story, whether true or embellished, shows the tension, desire tugging against duty, forbidden but irresistible. Third joke, whispered like a smirk, one manual of confession warned against lusting for one's neighbor's wife. Which must have made for some very awkward confessionals. Imagine the priest sighing, again, Geoffrey. So behind closed doors, there weren't just prayers and duties, there were sighs, secret letters, glances at windows where shadows passed. Not every marriage kept hearts locked inside. Some wandered, quietly, dangerously, weaving romances that belonged more to dreams than to reality. And when you press your ear to that heavy oak tonight, you hear not only the warmth of laughter or the cadence of prayer, but the trembling hush of longing unspoken, desire that dares not move, but refuses to die. The air feels heavier now, not because of prayer or longing, but because of something you felt before, money. Behind those thick doors, couples didn't just share bodies and secrets, they shared, or fought over, finances. Because in medieval life, marriage was as much an economic alliance as it was a personal bond. You picture it, a husband counting coins at the table, brow furrowed, while his wife leans over, reminding him that she brought a dowry of 3 oxen, a chest of linens, and 2 fertile strips of land into this union. And she's not going to let him forget it. Mainstream fact? In most medieval societies, marriage contracts spelled out money, property, and dowries in painstaking detail. These documents were legally binding, making clear who brought what, and what protections the wife had if her husband died. Wealth, not romance, kept the family afloat. And the quirky tidbit? In some towns, there were actual public ceremonies where the dowry was paraded in front of neighbors. Imagine it, villagers watching as chests, livestock, and even feather beds were displayed like trophies. Historians still argue whether these displays were about legal transparency or sheer social bragging rights. First joke, dry as straw. Imagine having your IKEA furniture paraded down the street today. Look. Gerald has brought a futon, 3 beanbags, and a blender. What a catch. But behind the laughter, you sense real tension. Because once the dowry changed hands, power shifted. A husband often controlled the property, but a wife retained legal claim to what she'd brought. Disputes flared when husbands mismanaged money, or when wives felt cheated. Behind closed doors, arguments about who owns what could sting sharper than jealousy. And yet, some marriages leaned on teamwork. Peasant couples worked side by side, he plowing, she weaving, both calculating how to stretch pennies through winter. Love might not have been the foundation, but shared survival often built its own kind of bond. Historians still argue how much autonomy wives truly had over household money. Some charters show widows managing estates capably, lending money, even suing in court. Others suggest that many women's voices were drowned out by patriarchal control. The truth likely shifted with class, region, and personality. Second joke, whispered with a wink. One English proverb warned, "A man without a penny is like a body without a soul." Which means medieval romance novels would have read like bank statements. Her eyes sparkled like silver coins, her heart beat like a coffer chest. But money wasn't just tension, it was also intimacy. Couples sometimes inscribed gifts with tender words, blending wealth with affection. A silver girdle, a brooch, a book bound in leather. Practical, yes, but also personal. To give a spouse something lasting meant more than flowers that withered. Still, wealth could warp love. Some noble marriages ended in annulment if dowries weren't paid in full. A husband might abandon a wife whose fortune disappointed him. A wife might resent being reduced to a walking investment. And among peasants, the inability to scrape together a dowry could mean no marriage at all. Third joke, playful but weary. Imagine explaining divorce today by saying, "Sorry, she promised me 2 cows, but I only got 1.5. That's medieval prenup drama. So you feel it now, the pulse of coins beneath the blankets, the weight of property pressing down on intimacy. Love was tangled with livestock, desire weighed against acreage. Behind those closed doors, couples weren't just whispering sweet nothings, they were calculating, bargaining, sometimes resenting, but always bound together by the economy of survival. The silence lingers after the clink of coins fades. In the hush, you realize that every stolen kiss, every laugh, every prayer was tied, somehow, to the clatter of money chests and the shadow of contracts. Behind those doors, passion and property were 2 sides of the same worn coin. The rooms grow quieter now, not from the absence of love or money, but from distance. Because medieval marriages weren't always about sharing every moment together. In fact, many couples spent long stretches apart, separated by wars, pilgrimages, trade journeys, or the relentless demands of feudal duty. Behind closed doors, sometimes one half of the couple wasn't even there. You picture a woman alone in her chamber, staring at the candle flame. Her husband has ridden off to join his lord's campaign in France, promising to return before the harvest. She waits, season after season, managing the household, clutching the ring he left behind. Mainstream fact? Absence was woven into medieval marriage. Noblemen were often called away for military service or political duty. Merchants vanished for months on trade routes. Even peasants could be separated by seasonal labor, shepherding flocks far from home. Marriage meant endurance across distance. And the quirky tidbit? Some couples developed secret love codes in letters. For example, a merchant might draw tiny hearts in the margins or slip a pressed flower inside. One wife even sent a lock of hair with her letter, instructing her husband to keep it under his pillow until he returned. Historians still argue whether such tender gestures were rare exceptions or common practice among literate couples. Here's the first joke, soft as a sigh. Imagine waiting 6 months for a medieval text message, only to find out your spouse's handwriting was so messy you can't even read the "I miss you." But absence did more than test affection. It forced trust. A wife alone had to believe her husband wasn't straying in a distant tavern. A husband away at war had to hope his wife wasn't falling for the neighbor who helped repair the roof. These suspicions, whispered at night, weighed heavily. Historians still argue how faithful couples really were under such strain. Some records show genuine loyalty, with partners reuniting after years apart. Others reveal scandals, illicit affairs, bastard children, or bitter annulments when long absence stretched too far. Second joke, dry and rueful. One medieval letter begged, "Remember me in your prayers." Which is sweet, until you realize that's basically the 14th century version of "Don't forget I exist." But distance wasn't only pain. It sometimes deepened affection. When couples reunited after long separations, the joy could be overwhelming: tears, laughter, even neighbors celebrating. One chronicler described a knight falling to his knees upon seeing his wife again, kissing the hem of her gown like a pilgrim at a shrine. Letters reveal tenderness too. A merchant once wrote to his wife, "Though I cross mountains and rivers, your face is the map that guides me." Was he exaggerating? Of course, but exaggeration is half the art of missing someone. And sometimes, distance brought growth. Wives managing estates developed authority and skill. Husbands wandering through markets or courts carried back stories, gifts, and new perspectives. In absence, each learned independence. In reunion, they had new selves to share. Third joke, with a grin, one soldier wrote home complaining about the cold, the mud, and the food. Centuries later, you realize medieval long-distance couples were basically living the same script as modern long-distance texts: "I'm tired. I'm hungry. Send snacks." So behind those doors, absence wasn't silence, it was filled with letters, prayers, memories, even suspicions. The bed felt wider, the nights longer, the walls more hollow. But love, or duty, stretched across the miles, tethering two hearts by invisible thread. And when the latch finally clicks again, and the long-gone spouse returns, you hear the thud of boots, the gasp of recognition, the rush of footsteps across the floor. Behind closed doors, distance collapses, and the waiting finally ends in an embrace that feels like survival itself. The shadows press closer now, as if the night itself wants to remind you that even in the Middle Ages, behind those thick doors and creaking shutters, life was messy, imperfect, and strangely familiar. Because beneath all the rituals, the contracts, the prayers, and the silences, couples were just human. They loved, they fought, they laughed, they compromised, they longed, and in the end, they carried on. You see them clearly now, a husband and wife sitting at the edge of a straw mattress, their candle burning low. They're not talking about saints or property, not whispering secret desires for distant nights or worrying about dowries. They're arguing about whose turn it is to fetch water from the well. Mainstream fact? Household survival was a shared labor, no matter how divided by gender. Husbands mended tools, wives mended clothes, and both had to rise at dawn to face relentless work. The shared grind built resilience, and sometimes, affection. And the quirky tidbit? Some surviving household account books reveal the tiniest human squabbles, a husband noting expenses for ale my wife bought against my will, or a wife listing money lent secretly to my cousin. Historians still argue whether these jottings were passive-aggressive digs, or simply honest record-keeping, but either way, you can hear the bickering echoing across centuries. First joke, gentle but knowing. Imagine your credit card statement literally saying, "Starbucks, against my will." That's medieval marriage on parchment. Because love wasn't grand most of the time, it was practical. It was the wife saving crusts of bread so her children wouldn't starve. It was the husband giving up his cloak on a freezing night so she could sleep warm. It was whispered apologies after sharp words, reconciliations before sleep, and the simple choice to wake up the next day and keep going together. Historians still argue whether medieval couples found genuine happiness in this grind, or whether affection was mostly squeezed out by survival. But in the quiet spaces, letters, jokes, the way one set aside the better cut of meat for the other, you catch glimpses of tenderness. Second joke, sly, one medieval proverb declared, "A woman's tongue is her sword," which probably came from a husband who just lost an argument. And even the disputes, the shouting, the sulking, were signs of engagement. Silence could mean despair, noise meant the couple was still fighting for their bond. Behind closed doors, noise and laughter lived side by side. You imagine their children asleep in the corner, wrapped in blankets. The couple lying down at last, murmuring good night. Maybe they touch hands in the dark. Maybe they dream of better days. Maybe they simply let exhaustion carry them into sleep. But whatever else happened, they carried one another into tomorrow. Third joke, whispered with a smile, medieval marriage manuals said couples should avoid excessive quarreling. Which is adorable, considering some marriages lasted 50 years. Excessive quarreling wasn't avoided, it was basically the soundtrack. So behind those doors, there was no perfect harmony, no endless passion, no saintly patience. There was compromise, resilience, the messy weaving of two flawed lives into one shared story. And that, perhaps, is the most shocking truth of all, they weren't so different from us. And now, as the candles burn down, the hush becomes absolute. Which means it's time to wind down, too, softly, slowly, letting the story slip into stillness. You let your breath soften now, sinking into the rhythm of the night. The walls that once echoed with arguments, with laughter, with sighs and prayers, feel quiet again, quiet in the way of centuries folding over themselves. Those medieval couples, with their fears and their flaws, their longing and their laughter, they've all drifted away. But you can still feel them, faint as the glow of embers in a dying fire. The images blur, candle flames flickering like stars, hands brushing in the dark, voices rising and falling like waves. What was once shocking, or strange, or even absurd, settles now into something gentle. These were people who tried, just as you do, to love and to live within the limits of their world. Your mind loosens its grip on the details. The coins clinking, the parchment rustling, the creak of wooden beds, they drift like background hum, far away now, harmless. What stays is the warmth, the way a laugh can survive across centuries, the way a whispered word of comfort still matters more than all the contracts, the way even in struggle, there was tenderness. And so you breathe deeper, slower. Each inhale carrying calm, each exhale releasing weight. The doors close softly in your imagination, but not with fear, with rest. Nothing waits outside. Nothing presses in. Only stillness, steady and kind, wrapping you like a cloak.